Hello and welcome back to the Apprentice One-to-One podcast. It's been a couple of weeks, but I'm back tonight with our usual hosts, Richard and Craig. We're going to have a brief chat about Amendment 4. That's just come out today, actually. And then we're going to get into the earthing and bonding we've been promising for a few weeks now, even actually probably a couple of months. But before we do that, let's catch up with the guys and see how they're doing. How are you, Craig?
Yeah, good. It's Wednesday, is it? Yeah, Wednesday, but it feels like Friday. Looking forward to a chilled weekend, but, fortunate to be busy, keeping going, looking forward to reading Amendment 4, because I haven't managed to get on the webinar today, so I got stuck on site, and I haven't managed to read any of the documents yet, so it'll be interesting to hear you guys, and I guess I'll be giving some raw views based on what you are saying, and go for there. But yeah, excited. It'll be good.
We've got the Oracle of Amendment 4 with us actually in the top left corner, and that's Richard. How are you doing, mate?
I don't know about that, but yeah, I'm very well, thanks. Very busy. As always, lots to talk about with, of course, the release a week ago today of Amendment 3. And we've done a bit of work around that, which we'll probably have a talk about in a bit in terms of existing installations. And of course, off the back of that was the announcement of Amendment 4. So just when we thought that, wow, there's another change, we've got another change and a new book in a couple of years' time is the projected release date. But of course, we'll probably delve into that a bit more in a bit. But yeah, apart from that, mate, all good and more to the point. How are you doing? Because you like sporting a new haircut there and another new tan. How does the dancing do?
I'm doing good apart from wholesaler problems. Today I've spent all day chasing around buying roof hooks because they delivered us 2 boxes for this job. I was well in advance, but they sent the wrong hooks in the box and I never opened it to check until today. So I'm blaming the wholesaler and everyone else is blaming me, but we got sorted in the end. So that's one of the problems when you're out doing the job and trying to run a business. It's not easy. But otherwise, I'm well. I'm like you said just then, Richard, it's interesting that Amendment 3 was the cool chat of town, wasn't it? Until a couple of weeks ago. And then we had this curveball kind of drop out. I think, was it Mark Coles and the IET first mentioned they were going to be doing the Amendment 4 draft for public comment. And I think there's a 3-month window on that. We'll get into the specifics in a second. But Amendment 3 has kind of been forgotten about now, but that has actually been published. So have you got any bits there that were finalised, that were changed from the draft we spoke about earlier on in the podcast, or is it pretty much as it was?
In Amendment 3?
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously, we was involved as a charity with, like we are involved with all changes or additions or amendments and all the rest of it. So we were quite keen to get Amendment 3 published and over the line, but being part of JPAL Subcommittee B and D, all those comments that were put within the DPC for Amendment 3, we had to go through every single comment, so none of them got ignored. And of course, all the JPAL subcommittees are made up of some of the bigger organisations and certification bodies, but also experts within those fields. So Subcommittee B looks after thermal effects, fire, etc. And that's got lots of specialists around fire and things. And I've learned so much being part of that subcommittee group because I've never touched upon it or I don't have that much experience in that field. But similarly, Subcommittee D looks after all Part 7. So any changes and, additions or corrections and things, we've been directly involved with that. So we were involved directly with Amendment 3 regarding, the unidirectional, bidirectional device saga. But, potentially we could have issues where we've got devices that aren't designed for that, aren't meant for that. So I'm glad that it's been put in and, we welcome that as a charity. We support that. But the problem you've got then is with existing installations where you have a device that is marked as unidirectional, then how are you going to code that? So part of what we do, and Dave runs the RAG within Electrical Safety First, which is the Wiring Regulations Advisory Group, which is made up of all of the big players. So NAPIT, NIC, IET, Sitting Guilds, everyone, we all come together, which is difficult. And with this particular amendment, we had 4 separate meetings. And I spoke to Dave, obviously I was with Dave today, and when he's got a bit of time and he's not judoing, he'll come on and talk a bit more about the RAG. But we knew that this was going to be released. And then, it's quite clear with brand new installations as a designer what you've got to comply with. That's Amendment 3. But what about existing installations? So within the RAG, we all came together and question 2.63 on the RAG, I'm sure that Mark will put a link to it, provides some guidance if you're undertaking a periodic inspection and test and you come across a device that is marked as unidirectional. Well, it's quite clear then that it's marked as unidirectional. If you've got another source of supply that can potentially go or feed back the other way, like a solar PV installation, battery storage, vehicle to grid, etc. Potentially, with RCDs in particular, it could render them inoperable. So if you're relying upon it for additional protection, then a C3 code is recommended because it's not necessarily dangerous, but it would certainly, if you changed it for a bidirectional one, it would improve the safety. It's recommended. However, if it's a TT installation or where you can't achieve your max ZS values and you rely upon that RCD for fault protection, it's obviously potentially dangerous. So it's a C2. But if the device, for instance, doesn't have any markings on it, or you're not sure, then the advice, of course, is to contact the manufacturer of that product, because it's going to be reliant upon the manufacturer declaring via a declaration of conformity whether those devices are suitable or not. So there is a manufacturer out there that has got devices that are marked unidirectional, but they've been tested and they are suitable for energy flow in both directions, current flow, and that there is on their website a declaration of conformity. So what you'd have to do is contact the manufacturer, confirm whether or not they're suitable. If they are suitable, there's no issue. There's no code. You'd probably make a note of it, and you'd certainly append that documentation to your report to say that I've done the groundwork on it. I've contacted the manufacturer, even though they are marked as unidirectional. The manufacturer has declared they're okay to use as bidirectional. And again, that question is within the RAG, and it's been agreed by consensus by everybody. So NAPID can't argue with the NIC, and the NIC can't argue with the ECA and all that. So really useful source of information, because it's difficult. What do you do? How do you code it? And what we don't want is blanket coding. Oh yeah, look, it's marked unidirectional C2. That is C2. And along with that, and I don't know whether you guys have seen it, but BEMA have got some great information on the website, and they've just produced a lovely one-page PDF document looking at different devices, MCBs, RCDs, and RCBOs, and it just gives us a bit of information about the type of information we should be looking for. And there's a bit of information on the bottom around unidirectional and bidirectional. It's really, really useful. So, if you do your certification paperwork on an iPad, then why not keep, some of these guides and that in particular as a PDF, and you can reference it. And it's just really useful information, really, really good. So Amendment 3, yeah, it's there. It's quite clear for new installations, design work and all that. But what are we looking for in a periodic? So really, really good. So, yeah.
What I liked about Amendment 3 before we end up talking about Amendment 4 was I felt that, obviously, I know it was only like a short paragraph, like sort of a sentence effectively, but I think it really helped clarify the wording for understanding for those that maybe weren't as in the field as, somebody like Mark. For example, like for me, I don't do solar installs. If we get solar come up in one of our tenders, we sub that out to, other contractors who will come and do that element of that work. So it was, you hear a lot of this bidirectional, unidirectional going on. You're like, but I'm not really in it day to day. And sometimes I think we all know that the regs can be worded in a way which they have to be worded. And I understand why they are the way that they are. But not all of us, if you're not doing that day in, day out, understand that fully. And I think that release of that amendment just helped put that into more plain English, if you like, to help us understand what we should be doing. If me, as a non-solar installer, happened to do an EICR where there was solar installed, I could understand what I was looking at now. So I thought it was a good addition instead of a negative addition, personally.
Yeah, it's the reaction, not reactionary is the wrong word, but the regs adjusting maybe more to industry as well. It's a good sign that there's maybe going to be more of that. We're on to the Fourth Amendment now, which is unusual, I think, in a cycle of a regulations book, although not totally unheard of. And we've had the corrigendums and other smaller amendments as well. So maybe there's that shift in approach. from industry where it is going to react a little bit. They can make changes more quickly. And then we'll get onto the Amendment 4 chat in a minute, where there's more of the harmonisation adjustments that are needed. So, yeah, I think that's really good.
And the DPC is so important because, as Craig, just to touch on Craig, and he likes the way that the new regulation has been put together and the wording within it. The wording within the original regulation, it was changed quite a bit because of the comments in the DPC. And, reviewing some of those comments, and, we took note of, obviously we saw your comments within there, Mark, and lots of other installers out there, designers and other people, because it's important that you take that on board, because if there's a regulation there or something that's in the book and you can't, there's a bit of a grey area around it, that needs to be cleared up, and as you said, that our standard has to align with the harmonised standards and the European standards, etc. But it has to make sense here. So the final regulation that was released last week within Amendment 3, the wording of it, as I say, when it went forwards and backwards a few times, but I think in the end we got it and we took everyone's comments on board. And I think, as Craig said, it's the way it's put together now is clear.
I think we can learn a bit as installers as well by getting involved with the draft public comments. It's actually changed my view through the course of the discussion around all of that after I'd made those comments as well, just from listening to what kind of the intent was and some of the things that, were out in industry that other people, as Craig said, maybe wouldn't understand, that solar installers and such would. And again, with Amendment 4, it is so important that installers do offer that feedback. And I will drop a link in alongside this show where you can go off and do it on the BSI website. I was on there this morning. There's 2 PDF files that you can download that kind of highlight the core changes if you want, and then it's broken down into 4 sections, so you can do it in smaller bite sizes of about 170 pages in each one, to go through the actual, the new draft and suggest any changes in your wording or whatever that you want to put forward. Is all I would say is, when you are making a suggestion, try and other people have already said this, but word it in the way that the regs need to be written, rather than just an opinion. Got to try and make simple questions and people on the other end to make use of that comment. Otherwise, it may not be apprehended in the way that you want. But yeah, do get involved. It's really important. As a trainee, electrician, business owner, all of those views, as Richard said, will be worked through.
Yeah, and the reason it's into 4 sections reflects the 4 subcommittees of JPL, because of the 4 sections, those comments on those parts of the book will go back to the 4 subcommittees to review. That's why there's 4 sections. And of course, the book within itself is quite huge. So if you were to just have the whole book, it doesn't really help. And it helps when everyone's comments are compiled together to enable all the subcommittees to take them on board and try and understand the intent and go through them. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm just glad to that, Craig. I can see you looking down there.
I'm looking at the highlights of what they've put in effectively. I'm just looking at the Amendment 24, and I think it's good. Obviously, I'm not reading the whole amendment. I'm not doing that from scratch, but looking at it is, they've got things which I think are relevant to industry now, talking about energy efficiency, talking about, because energy bills are a huge part, right? Being more efficient with what we do is going to help. I assume that's where it's going. I haven't read it yet, but it looks like that's where it's heading towards. Understanding how we manage it, understanding new chapters going in to deal with more sorts of technology like batteries and stuff, and getting a better grasp on that just from the headlines they've got. I mean, I think it shows we're probably being listened to, and we're probably adapting to what's happening in industry now, because everywhere you go, there's a conversation about a Part L board or Part L energy. We're looking at energy efficiency, we're looking at batteries, we're looking at solar, we're looking at how we can be greener, we're looking at all these multiple sources of supply. And from just looking at the contents page of the first PDF, it looks like they're starting to address those areas, which is nice to see them being reflective and adapting to what we sort of need, if you know what I mean. Because up for a long time, people have said they're outdated or they don't contain what we do in industry. It looks like they've had a bit of an overhaul, and they are coming up to where we probably are in industry at this point in time.
Yeah, such a good point, Craig. Industry is often blamed for not being up to date enough, and then we're moaning at them because they're changing everything too often, so they can't win. But you're dead right, having that adjustment. But to set out a little bit with this amendment, Richard, and just to set out, Richard not told us the inner workings of any of this. We're learning with everyone here what he knows, has not forwarded the Amendment 4 to us pre this podcast or pre today. But the changes, are they more kind of to do with harmonised standards? I know from speaking on the Renewables podcast with Graham Kenyon and Michael Peace that there's set things that filter down that we have to put into our regulations. And I think from what I can see, a lot of these things in Amendment 4 are to do with that.
Yeah, so different part, and what we're talking about is if anyone that's got a regs book in front of them, if you look on page 15, it lists actually all the harmonised and IEC standards, and the European standard, which is HD 60364-1, or all the parts of it. The numbering system of the harmonised standard, we followed suit. So 60364-1 is part 1 in our book and part 1 in the European standard. So any changes within that standard, well, then we have to take on board the technical intent and apply it within our standard. So currently, 60364-1 is under maintenance within Europe, and representatives of the IT and other organisations will have members within those committees and maintenance teams as well. So that any changes within that, then we'll kind of know beforehand, and those changes will have to be filtered then into our standard. So there's been no real changes within part 1 yet, but that particular part of the European standard is to be, it's been looked at and been, there's maintenance happening to it. So any changes are likely to come out in 2025. So even though at the moment within Amendment 4 there are no changes in part 1, doesn't mean that there won't be changes within part 1 before it comes out. It's unlikely. That's why that Mark Coles have quite rightly said today that we're looking potentially at 2026, but it may be later. Or if there's any significant changes, they might be left until the next edition, whatever that will be, etc. So yeah, it's all based on changes within the international European standards where there's changes happen for a number of reasons. Maybe, there's been a lot of fires due to something or whatever, or there's been editorial changes or other new technologies have come in. We then look at those and decide whether, we have to take the technical intent on board anyway, and then changes will be made following that. But as we know, some regulations are UK specific because of certain issues that we've come across, and we apply them, within the UK. So it's quite complex, but page 15 gives you a good rundown of all the various different harmonised standards. And if you were to borrow those standards separately, it would cost you thousands. So obviously in 2026, whenever the Amendment 4 comes out, it's another new book, unfortunately.
Yeah. So it was just to set that out to trainees, really, that there's kind of this update cycle. Because there's a lot of people in industry now who may be on their first version of the regs.
Yes.
You've obviously been at this a bit of a while now. And usually Craig, what we get is a couple of amendments, possibly a third one, where there's a lot of this kind of stuff that just gets filtered down. We've had the RCD development through the last, I think that's the last real big one, EV charging and such as well that come in. So there is some big changes that happen, but generally it's these tidying up between international standards and the standards that we impose here in the UK. And that's a lot of what we've got here, and some other tweaks around the edges that we can maybe get into. I don't want the podcast to be just about Amendment 4, breaking it down. There was a great webinar today by Mark Coles and the IET team, good friend Craig O'Neill and Michael Peace on there as well, where they've really kind of blown that apart and set out what all of this is. So I'll link in the description to that. And Darren from CEF, so Darren Staniforth and Dave Austin did another sit down with Mark Coles on LinkedIn that was on for about an hour. I've only watched half an hour of that so far, pre-recording this with you guys, but that's really good as well. So we'll reference into those. And on Sunday, we have the Real World Sparky View from the Electricians podcast, because I believe they're going live and talking about it as well. So we'll get opinions from all over the place on this. And the important thing is that, it's getting attention, I think, and people are going to go and interact with that document and offer some feedback. One of the big things I took away from the webinar earlier today, there was a couple actually. One was the changes around medical areas. It seemed there was a lot of changes in that space. And then to do with coding and FI in particular, that now isn't going to result in an unsatisfactory or doesn't have to, as was prior kind of the understanding. So I think that's good that they've actually defined that. Whatever your view is, if it should or shouldn't be, they've actually said you don't have to. So I think that's a good move.
I've just found a table that I wasn't sure if it was going to be in on this one or not, and actually they seem to have backed it. So on Amendment 2, and I think it was about page 18, there was a table that sort of listed out the details about recommended means you should and so on and so forth. And it was the first time, I believe, we'd seen that into the regs to kind of clarify that. And just having a quick flick through, they seem to have expanded it now and put sort of possibility and capability as other words that we got to start to look at and think about. And they seem to have tried to explain it, because I personally always found the recommendation situation confusing, because to me, I recommend you do something or you should do something had two very different tones to the conversation. Because I reckon everybody's breaking the recommendation that they should have done by putting AFDDs on all of the socket circuits, because I don't imagine that's generally going on in industry. But so it's nice to see they've tried to even explain something as sort of at the starting point of that for me. I'm glad they've backed it and not scrapped it, and it seems to be something they're developing. So, yeah, I'm intrigued by that table. I need to do some digging around it, I think.
But the point of that is that they're trying to standardise the language that's used across other British standards and other forms of legislation and guidance, because otherwise you can have 3 or 4 words for the same meaning, which doesn't help. It gets very confusing. So slowly, they are trying to standardise the language across all different standards, because, of course, 7671, within 7671, it references over 1,000 other different standards, most of them listed in Appendix 2. And it will say, for further information, say BSEN 6177-4 or whatever it is. So, they're trying to keep everything standardised across all standards. So if you have access to some of those standards, which you probably do yourself, Craig, as a designer, and we have as an organisation, we've got access to all of the BSOL standards, then, because, our paths do cross over with product standards and other standards, because you need to delve a little bit deeper in it. And you want to make sure the language that is in 7671 is very similar to the otherwise you get even more confused. So I agree that was a great addition. And like you said, they've expanded upon it. So very, very good, to be fair.
That was one of the complaints in the webinar, actually. One of the questions that somebody had was around the way these regs are worded and can't they write it in proper English. And Darren Cranis and Graham Kenyon were in that live chat saying that they would very much like that to be the case, but there's BS0, and
that's right.
That kind of dictates how these things,
which is the standard for writing standards, BS0. Yeah.
So
it's a delightful read if anybody's interested in trying to join any committees. I think it's quite a long one from what I remember opening. I can't say I got cover on it yet.
One of the things I did like in the Amendment 4 as well is the reference to the PAS document that's just been implemented around batteries, that they've actually got that in there, because I think that's something industry needs to get joined up. Again, just speaking selfishly as solar installers, where we've got MCS standards that are telling us certain things, we've got manufacturers telling us something else, we've got this PAS document and wiring regulations. Having all of those places kind of join up what they're telling us is really, really useful. So it was good to have that in there as well. And the energy efficiency side, I know I said this when that was first proposed, actually. I think it kind of got brought in, I don't know if it was at the start of the 18th edition or towards the end of the 17th. And it's how you could actually define that, because putting bigger cables into people's houses might give better energy efficiency for their use of that. But transporting and manufacturing those larger cables and the raw materials that we're extracting from the earth that may not spread as far as they could do. I think there's a bigger question around all of that that's very, very difficult to drill down into and answer as if it is energy efficient or not at that level. I guess that's something we're all working on day to day at the minute with net zero and stuff.
Yeah, and it's nice to see that they've removed that, or the proposal is in Amendment 4 to remove that out, and that will be a separate guidance moving forward. It shouldn't be requirements as part of 7671. So that, I'm listening to that with great interest. That'll be interesting going forward, that will.
I haven't listened to anything yet, and obviously I know tonight's not us trying to be an Amendment 4 overview for anybody, but what I've just quickly scanning and sort of first time looking at it found interesting is they've now deleted mode 1 and mode 2 charging from the definitions. I wonder if that means that EV is going to be scrapping that as a recognised method moving forward, which would be good because it's not really been a recognised method. It's kind of been the way the car salesman sold you the car, in my opinion. So it'd be good to see that sort of get adapted and tighten up on there as well, where it would affect other standards, if that's the path it's taking, because I'm literally just looking at the definitions right now to see that. So it's, it looks like we are moving much more in a let's be safer, let's be more efficient, and let's everybody understand what we do, instead of having lots of different potential opportunities. Let's try and make it more streamlined.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
And Craig O'Neill, who read out one of the segments on that webinar, he wasn't asked directly, but somebody asked in the chat around that about outdoor metal switchgear, which we've had mentioned before, and he's got an article soon coming out on that from the IET. So, they're listening to what the chat is out there. I don't think we can ask for fairer than that for people kind of trying to guide industry and produce these documents. Having a little peek behind the window in some of the stuff I'm involved with Apprentice 1-to-1, which is nothing to do with JPL 64 or wiring regs, and the complexities that are there, this must be an absolutely mammoth task. So it's like no hard feelings from me, certainly, towards these amendments. For anyone who is wondering on the feedback period, I think it's the early November when the window is cutting off comments. It's about 12 weeks, something like that, which is pretty standard for the draft public comment. And then they've probably got a good few months batting those comments around, because there might be, hopefully, if everyone gets involved, a fair old few to be working through, and you need to allocate the time for that as well. I imagine, Richard, it's not a 2-week job, that, is it?
No, and you've got to try and schedule it so that all the members of those subcommittees are available to contribute towards that, because there are specialists within those subcommittees that need to contribute towards it. It's not just one person's opinion. And it's certainly not the IET, which a lot of people think it is. So, it's the IET, it's them again, and I've got to buy a new book, and I've got to pay 600 quid for a course and all the rest. It's not about that. And more needs to be done to try and explain that, the process of, I'd like to think we'd kind of give a bit of an insight into that this evening, talking about, and I've got a better understanding of it now because I'm directly involved with it. So that's important as well.
And I think almost as my final point in it before we move on is what you just said there, being quite powerful, that I've had conversations with people about how these regs are conformed, and I think Mo had something happen at A1-to-1 about this as well, where it's like, it's not that one person leaves that room getting in the way. Everybody in the room might disagree, but you've come to a mutual acceptable agreement, and it's a mutual acceptable agreement that goes into the regs, not necessarily one person got the way over 10, 12, 40 people, however many people are on each of these subcommittees. It's a consensus. The regulations are a consensus of a group of professionals in the room. Like you say, it's not just the IET wanting to make money.
No, and sometimes they don't get it right all the time. The intent of it sometimes goes down a different road, and it has unintended consequences. Earlier one this year was the safety service of your domestic smoke alarm systems and things that had an effect, didn't it? And equally within Amendment 4, where they introduced back in Amendment 2 the need for RCDs for outdoor lighting. It's not all outdoor lighting that it's required on, but currently is. And yet, contractors are putting RCDs on column lights in car parks and things, but the accumulation of the leakage is causing them to trip because they've got to be able to 30 milliamp according to that. So there are some changes that are being made to that, or proposed changes. And that's why it's a great opportunity for everyone, as Mark quite rightly said, to put some constructive comments. They're inviting us to do that, everyone to do that, but make sure they're constructive and try and counteract whatever's there with a different solution. So I don't think this is right because of this, but I propose this. There's a problem, but actually here's a solution to it, or it's all constructive and positive. So there's a lot more to it than what people think.
Yeah, I saw the comment in the webinar again about street furniture and RCD protection of lampposts and stuff.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting that is going to get some more guidance in the regulations, because I think clearing those question marks up it's something electricians are asking for. So I think, it's good to see that it's happening. Just as you mentioned in courses, Richard, the way I've always approached wiring regs is every time there's a new addition, I take the courses, and on the amendments, I do kind of CPD, unless the CPS are telling us we need to do a course to maintain our membership. That's just the way I've always done it. Yeah. Do you think there'll be a need for anyone to do an update course in terms of that? I'm just thinking of the trainees coming through now who might be on kind of 18th edition. Would they then need to do an update upon qualifying, or do you think they're good till the 19th? I'm
going to approach it that I'm interested in what Craig thinks, but certainly when it's released, I will be going and updating my qualification, because 2018, I remember when the 1st of July, when it landed on my desk when I was in a previous training provider, and I did that exam more or less straight away, because, I'm quite good in terms of, navigating the book and finding information. But a lot's changed since then. We're in 2024, we're in 2026 when it's released. So, you're looking at 8 years. So for me personally, I'll go back and do that and update my qualification to the latest amendment, which will be Amendment 4. We don't know what's going to happen then between Amendment 4 and the 19th, or would there be Amendment 5? Who knows? But that might be another 1 or 2 years. We'll update it then. Maybe. I mean, when Amendment 1 came out, that was just a quick amendment because they needed to address 722 around vehicle charging, open devices, etc. So I updated my knowledge, similar to both of yourselves on that. Didn't worry too much about that. Amendment 2 came out. Again, there was some decent changes in that, but I didn't feel like I needed to go and, do the course again. But certainly with Amendment 4, I probably will update my knowledge on that. There'll be a new version of the qualification, so it'll be 2382-26, for instance, wouldn't there? So it'll be interesting whether Craig or yourself will do it. We'll see.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I approach this in a range of different ways. So when I was teaching, I would always do the exam, because I think as the lecturer, you should make sure that you have proven your competence in the area that you are effectively delivering. And if you can't do that, then I'm sorry, in my opinion, you shouldn't be delivering it. It's quite simple. If you're fazed by that, then yeah, I just think you should be doing it and doing the assessment. From a trainee point of view, they won't officially need to do it. If they've got an 18th edition, they will be covered for their qualification by the 18th edition. You only have to actually retake the course, as we say, when it's a new amendment. So when the 19th comes out effectively, then everyone will have to redo it. So, but for me, again, in my role currently, I will probably do the course because I know what I'm like, and I'm sure it's just me, but I can be lazy. And I can say I'm going to read stuff, and I can say I'm going to do something. By making myself go and do an exam, I force myself to have to prove that I've gone and done that learning, if that makes sense. And being in a design position, again, I treat that very much like a teaching position of, I don't know everything in the regs, please don't take this, I'm trying to do that. But in the area of the regs that I spend my time working in, I feel I should be able to have that conversation pretty competently, and an easy way to evidence that is by making myself go and taking the exam again. So I guess it depends where you stand on those similarities of that as listeners, I suppose, but I don't think any of the opinions we've said are wrong. Everybody just approaches it slightly differently, and with my best will in the world, I was going to listen to an IET webinar for Amendment 4 today, and I was stuck on a building site. That'll probably happen time and time again every time I set time aside to want to update my knowledge, unless I physically make myself take the time out of the working day to go and do it.
Yeah, you both make solid points there, and maybe I'll evaluate my views and do an update. It has been a few years actually since I've done the course. Time flies when you're having fun. Maybe if there's enough juice and meat on the burn, maybe I'll revisit it and go and do the course. I guess it depends. I think if it's not as big a changes as perhaps first appears, then maybe I won't. But I'll revisit that later on. If there's a new course coming out, why not? If all else fails, I'll just send Matthew to do it, and he can tell me all about it.
And it depends on what actually gets put into Amendment 4, because currently, everything's, the proposed changes are probably going to change or be reworded or taken out or even added to. So interesting to see. But yeah, personally, it's been a few years. I'm not saying I'd do a course because I don't need a course, but I would certainly take the exam and update, my gold card with that latest version of that qual. But
to be fair, we're talking 2026, aren't we? When this
exactly, so
and that's further in the future than now. Yeah. So yeah, it probably would be about time, to be honest.
It's 8 years, but then as and when that's released, if there's a potential Amendment 5 or the 19th edition, who knows where it's going to be after that? Will it be a year, 2, 3, 10? Who knows? So, but yeah.
Oh, I think we should all admit a grade's on here, and I can tell the future, so I got 100%. Yeah, job done.
I made sure I got 100% because Matthew got 96 and I had to beat him.
I wouldn't expect anything less great.
So
I mean,
sorry,
I did was it last week or the week before? Me and Dave did the level 4 design AAL qual, which was quite good. Refreshed my memory on a few bits and pieces and used some of the formulas out of Appendix 4 that I've not used before for operating correction temperatures for volt drop and the harmonic calculation, which was quite good. So that was interesting. Good discussion around running parallel supplies instead of using one bloody 4-core 400 mil. We could probably get away with running in, 2 180 mils or something. And then is that going to be easier to terminate other things you would consider them, Craig, because that's your thing, design. You're doing it all the time, every day, all day. So it was interesting. So I haven't got the results yet from the old 3-hour written paper. I'm supposed to get on this Friday. So I'll let you know how we got on. And then we've got a project to do similar to the 9.6, which is a nice car showroom, actually, which is going to be quite interesting with number of floor sockets and that where the cars sit. And there's a couple of EV chargers in there and a generator and a few other bits. So it should be quite interesting. But once again, results and get involved with it might be another good webinar to talk about learners that want to progress onto that, because for me, it's no different to the level 3, design unit within City and Guilds and AAL, just a little bit expanded on that. But if you've got a good understanding of design at that stage, then I'd go for it, to be honest. It's decent. So
there's the EEL ones marked in-house by the centres, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
So they're all the exams.
Yeah, they're not sent away. They're all in an envelope. When you don't see or anything, there's nothing. Out. You crack on with it. You get 3 hours. I found there wasn't sufficient space to get everything I wanted to get. So I had to add about 8 or 9 separate sheets to go with it, because you get into the realms of bits and pieces, and you're trying to add as much in as you can, because Craig, with 9.6, explain, describe. You're trying to talk about real life situations and how you apply the regs. That's what it's all about. It's about your understanding in it, not where any particular bit is. And I did C certificate in 1995, so I've got the equivalent qual, but I'm not one to sit back. I'm
on your walls.
Yeah, and I can't let Craig have 9.6 without having it. So if I don't get a distinction, I'm not going to be happy. But I'll let you know, and I'll prove.
And I think it's hard, isn't it? Because there's definitely a webinar we can do around 9.6 and EAL courses and that sort of stuff. But I seen the chief examiner's report for the City and Guilds June exam, and I think the national average pass rate was like 33% again or something out of everybody who sat it. And you're like, it does, I don't know, it does put some worries out there, I think, of
what if
qualified supposed experienced designers, and only 77% of them are failing.
Yeah. Well, one of the members of RAG writes papers for City and Guilds for that qual. So very nice chat. But we've had a few conversations, and there are holes in everything, but particularly, and I hope they never change that qual, because it needs to be at the level that it's at, and you need to know your stuff to do that. So
I'm doing a proper qualification that isn't as easy to pass. We always talk about this. I don't buy into some of the conversations around 2391 being loads easier than it once was. I think it is a little bit easier, but maybe not to the extent we like to make on. But there's other regulations, other qualifications, that have definitely become easier through time. And the level 4 design course is something that stood up against that, and it's still, and I think that's essential that it remains the case with that one.
But yeah, that's another conversation for another evening. But I'll give some feedback on that, and I'm sure Kevin, our good friend at the AL, Kevin Sparrow, will appreciate that. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was good. So, but I'll let you know if I don't beat Dave, I'm not going to be happy. And if Dave walked out 40 minutes before me, so I thought, oh God. But Dave's a designer as well. It's a bit like Craig is a proper designer, whereas I'm just a hairy ass spark, and I doing a bit like yourself.
Now I'm sure you'll have done well with it.
Yeah.
It leads on quite nicely actually to the earthing and bonding we said we were going to mention in this podcast. I'm just going to pop a shared screen up for us to talk through, but I think we'll just take it right to the beginning. These are pictures from the on-site guide primarily, and learners who are familiar with their college work will have seen these already, but I just thought it's a nice one for us to have a quick chat through. And
Might be out of my depth.
Starting with TNCS, and there's been a chat of actually around, earthing arrangements in the Amendment 4. We've spoken about it before, and how TNS maybe isn't a thing anymore, but we will have a look at what it should look like in a second. But with your TNCS there, you can see we've got a typical service head, a very old meter. They could do with updating that picture if they haven't already to a smart meter, and then there's the earthing that we want to look at primarily. So if we can see down there, we've got the main earthing terminal, and then we've got an earth that runs off to the consumer unit and the bonds over to the gas and the water. And your earth's coming off the neutral there inside the service head, isn't it, guys? Backside.
Yeah, and I think this is the most common variation I would imagine that most of us now working or into an industry are going to come across and deal with, I would say, for most of your career, especially those that are looking at maybe more domestic installs. I know there's other variations of how this can come in, but if we're keeping it at that sort of just starting point for tonight, then TNCS is what you're going to see. And you're looking at your sizing of your conductors, and it led me to think about a question which might be outside of tonight, but I'll pose it in a second anyway for some opinions. But from an apprentice point of view, you've now got to be understanding about the fact of the top part of the picture. You've got your element where you're entering your property, and you've got your external part, and understanding how this relates to ZS testing. So I have this conversation quite a lot where I ask people, well, why do we do a ZS test? And they don't necessarily understand that what we are measuring at that point is the fault path. They don't potentially necessarily understand that Z is the scientific symbol for resistance. So when we are breaking that down, we are talking about the internal and external resistance of your installation. And hopefully, apprentices are remembering that resistance and current are inversely proportional to each other, which is a word I hate because it's another example that doesn't make sense. But they do the opposite, right? Because that's too easy to say. So what we are measuring when we do these tests and looking at these earthing systems is, can we achieve the required disconnection times? Because if our resistance is too high, we're not going to generate enough current, and therefore we're not going to disconnect breakers. And instead of making it something really complicated, we should be looking at the fact of, well, all we are trying to do is use a variation of Ohm's law to make sure we can disconnect our devices based on protecting ourselves against electric shock. And if you can't achieve that purely by your breakers and your automatic disconnection of supply, we got to start looking at other elements that come in to support us with bonding taking place in the installation as well. And understanding how that relates to exposed and extraneous conductive parts, as the picture starts to talk about here. And yeah, I think it's understanding why we're looking at an earthing system rather than just a picture on a page and what we're trying to take from it, I think. I don't know if you have any other opinions on that before I pose my question to you.
So,
sorry, Richard, go for it.
Yeah, you're right. So, any apprentices, learners that are listening, if you got your on-site guide in front of you or handy, in section 2 or part 2 of the on-site guide, page 19, all these images, or very similar images, and all the details of the 3 common types of earthing arrangements are all within that part 2. So, and it's when you look at the path and you look at the conductors involved in that, it's quite simple to kind of break it down. But certainly with TNCS, the actual connection, the combined connection, the C part is within the cutout, and that basically the neutral and the earth are the same conductor, the pen conductor, and then from the cutout they're separate. So your T is your terra firma, that's your connection at the transformer end. N is your start point bit, and then your C is your combined part, your pen conductor, and then S is where it's separate within the installation. So what I did at one of the training providers I worked at is I acquired some cutouts from Lucy that make all the cutouts and stuff, emailed them, they were very kind, sent me some out. And I just made some, with some bits of armoured and stuff, made on a board with a meter, 3 of the common types of earthing arrangements you might come across within most, installations in the UK. So for the TNS one, I got a bit of old armoured cable, but made it look a bit like an old PILP cable. Soldered a bit of tinned copper to the outside of it to make it simulate, the TNS supply. Similar, did the same with a PME, and then cut a bit of the cutout out with me Dremel, so you could see the combined link inside it. Used a bit of concentric, so as if it was a CNE connection in the street. And then with the TT one, of course, you've got no earth provided, and then had a cut an electrode down and had that consumer side to say, there's my path back to the transformer by the general mass of earth. So there are ways to simplify it out and make it easier to understand. But if your college or your training centre has got anything like that, or ask your lecturers to build you something to explain it further. But there are some good illustrations in the on-site guide, and of course it's in appendix. It's in part 3 of the regs, but it's not as clear to understand because the line drawings are not a bit more technical, whereas the on-site guide's a bit easier to get your head around, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like you've both just said, understanding what the earthing system is it formulating your design going forward. When you are, qualified doing these things, you need to know what your earthing system is, because that's going to set out the protected devices you might be using, and other such things. And then, the fault path. I always think of this when I first started learning. One of the things I thought is, why do we want so much current flowing? Surely that's trying to stop that. But when you're clearing faults, you want as much current as possible to get them to operate quickly. So that's one of the things that I took a bit of time to grasp, to be honest, in the early parts of my learning. I'm sure I'm not the only person with those logical thoughts that seem logical at the time, but actually aren't. I mean, that's the inverse proportional thing that Craig was mentioning. That's the clever terminology around that. But yeah, these are the really common ones. TNCS systems, when they're working, are super effective. We've had the chat on social media around pen faults and things when, we can have problems with these earthing arrangements because of that. But in a functioning system, they provide a really reliable way of getting overcurrent protected devices to operate quickly and keeping installations safe. So this is why it is kind of the de facto earthing system in the majority of installations in the UK.
And I think just before we move off of this one, sorry, Mark, it's just as a learner understanding the fact that this might get called a PME supply as well, and understanding that it's still a TNCS earthing arrangement, it still has the same characteristics, which if you're in college will tell you your maximum ZE is 0.35 ohms. And if you can't get off the DNO, then you should be doing your design projects or whatever you're doing to that if you are using a TNCS earthing system, depending on the design arrangement currently. But yeah, just not being put off by people go, I've not heard of this PME system that I've got asked for in my exam, understanding they are the same thing. But the idea being, based on my understanding, which could be wrong, is along the DNO's network outside of your installation, there are several spaced out earth electrodes along the line of that supply cable, which is why it's a protected multiple earth, is because there are multiple earth electrodes in the mass of the ground. So it's not just your one earth conductor or your main earthing terminal that's taking that back. There are other things in there to help you deal with these, so just not getting confused on different terminology that mean the same thing.
And you can see that in that diagram or illustration that Mark's got on the screen there, that additional source electrode within or connected to that pen conductor. That's what Craig's effectively talking about there. It's where you've got an additional reference to earth along that supply cable, and that'll be referenced. I think it used to be every 30 or so meters, it used to be referenced off. And it can be, or generally they'll do that where you've got a joint, they'll reference it back to earth, or it can be at the end of the line. And coincidentally, my dad had a power cut last week from 7 in the morning till 7 at night. And when I went round to, I'd be a bit nosy really, the jointing lads were actually there jointing it, and it was the old aluminium pilt cable. And what had happened is that apparently that someone must have scored it all those years ago, and you've got to be so careful. Mine is scoring it, and it'll ingress moisture, will get into it, and the joint had failed, and they were having to joint it. But in the ground, it was TNS or SNE, so it was a separate line. Well, it was a 3-phase, obviously, and tapped off. So separate line conductors, separate neutral, and a separate earth. But they jointed it actually with a bit of full core. So what it looked like in everyone's house was TNS, but actually it was TNCS, because, full core cable is cheaper than 5. And within Amendment 4, there is reference to that now. If you can't guarantee from the distribution or network operator or sisters, whatever they call it, DSO now, that it is going to stay TNS and it's guaranteed, then you've got to treat it as being PLE. And that was, a prime example where they'd actually jointed it. The bit in the middle was 4 core, not 5.
Yeah, I guess that's why the regs. I mean, we've had the chat in industry for a bit now, haven't we? I think around that, but the regs, putting that forward as something that we do actually need to be considering. What you can see and what you can smell maybe isn't actually what it is. The next,
and I think as we're moving on to TNS.
Sorry.
Well, no, I was going to say I don't think it does in the way that, and I put a post out on LinkedIn a month or so ago about this, that the ENA, I think it was a few years ago now, the ENA actually put a letter out of similar effect, didn't they? I think it was when car chargers were coming around, and they said in their letter, unless you taking what you see in a building isn't the case, we've probably sent a tap most of the transformers in the UK now and made a joint somewhere along the installation that effectively everything is TNCS. And I've always had this, not to go on a side note too much, as a concern of, what we will discover as we go further through this series is things like your bonding conductor sizes are different, whether it's a TNS or a TNCS. Well, what one do you design to? If it was
that's right.
In a service head in the installation. But as what you're saying with Amendment 4, Richard, now is nobody's ever going to guarantee they're not going to change it in the future, because it's cheaper to center tap it effectively and joint it together.
Yeah.
Should we just be designing to TNCS now?
Yeah, worst case scenario, because in if the pen was to fail, those bonding conductors could carry that, returning current back somehow via the metallic parts of extraneous parts of the installation, because that's the design of it, that's the point. But would they be undersized, which they probably would be?
That's a good point. We're looking at the earthing arrangement in terms of maybe overcurrent protection, but we've also got your bonding conductors, as you rightly say, that could be carrying, suffering thermal effects because of those things that you've not taken account of, because it looks like TNS, but it actually isn't. We had an example on a job we're doing where a customer's bought 2 houses. It was semi-detached houses. They're knocking it through into one big detached property, and the supply on one side of the wall that would have divided the houses was what looked like TNS. On the other side was TNCS, and yet they were both off the same cable out in the street. They haven't brought separate supplies down, and it just shows you, doesn't it? That's probably the case up and down rows of housing in the country everywhere. So it's not easy, this, sometimes.
No, and I think from a let's say a traditional TNS point of view, the main difference you would have seen here is what Richard alluded to, is that you would not have had that neutral and earth combined, so you effectively would not have had that pen conductor. Because your pen conductor, for anyone not sure, was your protective earth combined with your neutral, which is where the pen comes from. So in this installation, you can clearly see that a separate earth has been brought into the installation from the supply, and that carries all the way through. It is not set on your service head equipment whatsoever. So I'm going to say the way for you to identify it is like the picture at the bottom where you see that you are coming off of your sheath. And quite often I have learners who remember this by saying that the S stands for the sheath. I know it doesn't, but it sometimes helps people when they go into their exams that it's coming off of the sheath rather than off of the service head. But yeah, like we said, this probably isn't going to be around for much longer, and to see it come into Amendment 4 of the regs is good because it's been kicking around the car charging standards for a while now, hasn't it? That thing, if you can't guarantee, then it should be in. So harmonising between them, I think, is a good thing. But for your exam, if you're doing your exam, then your ZE, highest ZE you can have for this is 0.8 ohms on a TNS installation.
Yep, and the last one is the one that's coming back on trend these days. Maybe not in the way we think of it as a TT system with island merding and such and driving electrodes in everywhere. It's actually not TT at that level. But the TT system is something that's knocked about since the kind of dawn of time, isn't it? Where we've had electrodes of some description in the ground forming the earth path, and kind of does what it says on the tin in a way, doesn't it? It's electrodes or mats in the ground.
You only need these for hot tubs, right? Isn't that the thing?
Well, I did that on my hot tub, wouldn't stop leaking when I put a rod through it. It's a lot there.
So I think from this point of view, there's a real complex piece we need to open up on TT, I think, moving forwards about what TT is and what it's not, because you've got all these recommendations, and I say this fully aware it might have come out of Amendment 4, but up until this point, you've got these recommendations of foundation earthing taking place in your installations as well. That effectively is based on the concept of a TT, although I know it wouldn't be a TT because it's still part of the equipotential zone, but we're talking about if we've lost that supply earth effectively, then having a backup earth. And I think that would lead us, and we're talking around this with to do with batteries and solar and stuff like you say, Mark, and looking at that, what we call a TT system, and whether there is actually a traditional TT system anymore, or whether, again, that is going to be more of a hybrid system now that we have to look to adapt because of pin fault detection, because of batteries, because of foundation earthing is starting to become a much bigger beast, whereas when I qualified, TTs kind of used to be the rarity unless you were out in the sticks of the country or some sort of agricultural. You didn't tend to work on them very much.
Yeah. So when you're talking about TT, it's the actual earthing system. People might put an electrode in or a hot tub that could be on a TNS or TNCS earthing arrangement. It's an earth electrode for that piece of equipment. And the same where they're actually asking in regulations for these electrodes to be driven in alongside TNCS for in case the pen was to be disconnected. We had it with EV charging, and now it's kind of a recommendation or a should, depending on your interpretation of that, to drive those in as well, or use a conjudisc or whatever else to have that in there. And then when we're talking about our island mode systems, and I've got a little diagram up here of that, it's having the electrodes on there, which would form the earth path when you are in island mode for your source generator, I guess is the best way of describing it. But equally, it's sat there all the same when you're in a normal grid connected state as that kind of backup electrode. So it's serving a couple of purposes there. So I think it is important to understand the difference between the TT when you're talking about that as an earthing arrangement. That is, as you'll see here at the bottom, where you've got an electrode, it's an old school one, on there, and that's kind of making your earth path off the main service head. And then there's other means to use electrodes within installations that are separate to that. Maybe befuddled my explanation of it, but I know what I mean.
think you've done it well. And I think for the learners, there's other considerations that we will talk about when we cover them, like whether you need RCD protection on TT systems. And but from an exam question point of view, you're probably looking along the lines of your reader must be less than 200 ohms to be deemed as acceptable. I think it's generally less than 100 ohms is what they deem as stable. And I think it's generally 20 ohms is what they say the DNO will tell you is the maximum sort of ZE of that when you're looking at it from an exam point of view. So you need to kind of remember those three values and understand that if you're putting the electrode in. And I guess Mark will probably have a much better explanation on this than me because he does a lot of TTs or has done in the past because he lives in lovely country land. But it's thinking about your conditions when you install these, because if you're only getting a 200 ohm reading on a soaking wet day, chances are when that ground starts to dry out, you no longer have a stable earthing connection effectively. And looking at that stability might be why you have other considerations to put in place. I mean, I think we're probably quite lucky in the UK because I don't think we're getting that dry a set of days to dry it out, but you may be looking to do this to move to Australia or Dubai or somewhere else where there may be considerations to think about and have a look at how you allow that and the reasons it could affect the TT installation, because I believe it's the earthing system that can be the most useful but can also be the most effective based on how you choose to install that in an installation.
100%. I think the frozen ground is the one that gets us most in the UK, which is why getting to the right depth. Certainly with the modern trend of conjudisc installs we're seeing now, because they are a lot safer to install. And I think the recommendation the manufacturer has on that is at least 600 mil deep. However, some people are getting acceptable results in nice sunny weather in summer in a wet hole where they're less deep than that. And we don't know the effects without going back on a frozen day to carry out that measurement. It may not be acceptable. And I've been on installs of the past where we've had to drive numerous rods in, one on top of the other, to try and get down, or have a separate drop of rods away from each other to try and lower that value to cover that off as well. So yeah, it's one of those where you can't just rely on getting under that 200 or 100 value. You have to have awareness of the ground conditions at the time and what they might be in the future as well to cover that off, because this is the fault path, as you said right at the start of this, Craig, which is going to get your protected devices to operate. And yeah, we might have some RCDs on there that are going to give us a bit better prospective operation, but still we want that fault current to be of a level that, we get it as high as we can, basically, don't we?
I want to sort of finish this on asking you a question, and it may be a question that we decide to leave for people to comment on to come back to next time, or you might want to...
Will be if I don't know the answer. That's exactly what we'll do.
Or you might want to discuss it tonight. We'll see. So, with regards to selecting earthing conductors, there are different methods in which to do so, either selection by table or the adiabatic equation. Do we think that tables should be an acceptable form of selection, or is it just a lazy way of designing?
That's a question and a half, that one, mate. I think the tables, as I understand them, always kind of err on the side of caution. So you might end up with something bigger than you need. I mean, you might have had an example that proves this wrong, but that's always been the way I looked at it. So I guess it could cost the client more money or make you more expensive in a tender as to what the adiabatic might result in you needing to use. But I think my understanding, and again, as Craig said, get involved in the comments alongside the podcast if you've got a view on this. Maybe don't give us the answer tonight, Craig, if you know it, and say what you think. Do you think those tables are suitable, or should we be working this out and doing it properly?
Well, what does the reg say? So 543.1.1 gives us options. So cross-sectional areas, the cross-sectional area of every protective conductor other than a protective bonding conductor shall be, so it's a shall. Option 1 shall be calculated in accordance with 543.1.3, which is the old adiabatic equation, or selected in accordance with 543.1.4, which gives us table 54.7. So there are two options. So either by selection using the table or by calculation. So and I won't comment on it at this stage, but leave it open to the listeners and see if they want to offer some opinions on that. And they might not understand what we're talking about, to be fair. We might need to just do a simple example of doing it in both ways and maybe do it from a big perspective, a big point, maybe on a distribution circuit or something like that from your side of it, Craig, from one of your jobs.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm faced with here. I've got two options. What option should I take? Or we'll run it both ways and see what everyone thinks. That might be a good way to do it. But
I suppose my secondary point to that for those who do then is if you take the table option, which will be the bigger cable, I'm not saying it's wrong, will be the bigger cable.
Yeah.
Will that then have an effect on the bonding conductors that you have to select in case to do so?
Great question. Yeah.
I think that's a really good question, and for sure it would. The degree of that might be affected by the earthing arrangement as well.
It ties in nice, that does. Yeah, it's good.
It opens up a can and a half of worms. I think we can come back to that. I think that's a good, as Richard and yourself just alluded to, it's a good conversation to have where we can really kind of break apart a bit and think about earthing and the size of the cables we're using. That may be the next conversation on all of this. I just wanted to mention that there is the IT earthing system as well. It's uncommon.
Yeah.
Medical environments, which is a big part of Amendment 4 based on the brief read-through I've given it today. That's quite common in those areas, so we can get a diagram of that, look into it, but it's not that out there in industry, certainly at apprentice and trainee level. So I've left that one off for now. And just referencing back into this kind of island mode setup here, as you'll see down at the bottom where the car, it actually says here that it's got its own electrode, and you can see that the TN system, CVC, has actually been disconnected. And it says requiring TTF in arrangement. It's actually calling it that. It's an electrode on that final circuit. And again, with your electrode here at the source, that's helping form the earth path when you are in your island mode state. So this is where the EESS system starts powering your maintained loads. They need an earth path, and this needs an earth reference, and that is kind of what that forms. Graham Kenyon and Michael Peace came on the podcast over on the renewables channel and explained that that's actually a TNS, or an interpretation of that in this setup rather than a TT. So I think this is where we get these hybrid earthing systems depending on what mode of operation you've got. And you can see your island mode isolator here that's disconnecting your battery storage system from the grid side of things, and with a nice neutral and earth bond relay in that as well. But that's into a whole other can of worms about all kinds of bits and pieces. It was really just to show that these earthing systems, whilst separate in their own right, can all form part of the equipment that you would use in those things, all form an installation at large, serving different roles, I suppose. And I'll pop all these diagrams again on the Apprentice 1-to-1 website for anyone who just want to go and look back into them. They might not be the up-to-date version from the on-site guide, but they did sit in there prior, and I think this one's actually from the EESS guide of a generation ago. So I've not got these from the current books because I don't want to be done for copyright. They are all at least one generation old. So they may not be current and proper. And there was a bit of an update around PNB as well that we were speaking about to do with TNCS, but I'm not going to complicate things by mentioning that. Unless there's anything you guys want to add to this chat, otherwise we'll come back and delve into an earthing example on cable sizes. Anything you want to add, Richard?
Just talking about island moding and things, just for apprentices and learners that are listening, this is additional learning. This goes into other quals, and this is the electrician plus side of things. So don't look at this and think, oh, crikey, I was struggling to understand the basic earthing arrangement. I don't know what I'm looking at there. This is blown my brain. So this is preparing you for the future, basically. So this is going beyond the basics which you need. This is something adding to that. So don't look at this and think, oh, well, I haven't been showed this by my lecturer, or I'm not aware of this. This is something additional because, we spoke about the regs and what makes the regs up and things like that. But this is all forming part of Part 7, special installations or locations, where there are specific guidance books, big thick books, just similar to the regs, to give that additional guidance and information just on that particular special installation or location. So your journey never ends.
No, good point. I was hesitant to include that, but I wanted to share the example of how an electrode, if you see an electrode on an install, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a TTF, and was kind of what I was trying to get to on that. Is there anything you want to add, Craig?
Well, I think just if this is what I was aiming this for apprentices and you're doing your learning, I was having a conversation with someone a few weeks ago and he said something interesting to me, which has kind of stuck with me since. If you can't kind of answer 3 whys about the situation you're dealing with, then do you actually know the answer? So push your lecturers, ask them the questions. This is TNCS system, we use it for this. Why? When they answer that, you go, why with that? And then why again? And you need to get that sort of 2 or 3 levels down. Don't just accept that surface level kind of initial explanation, because that's not a full understanding. And I certainly wasn't aware when I was training how big earthing actually was within an installation and how important it is. You know, it's one of the only things that can stop you working in a building if there's something wrong with it. So it's an area worth digging into.
Absolutely echo that. I can't remember all the links I've said that I will share. I've got the RAG on my list, the IET and the CEF Tech Talk. So if anyone...
And the Beamer PDF document is quite good. Yeah, which, you know, it's great for learners as well. I know that... our good friend Chris Horn from Witness College I've sent that to him. He's going to put it up in his workshops and give it out to the learners and things. So that'll be.
So in the description alongside this, you'll be able to find links over to all of those things on the draft for public comment as well. So you can actually go and feed that back on Amendment 4. I've really enjoyed chatting with you both tonight, guys. I think it's been a good podcast, covering a few topics and getting a bit of value in there around the earthing and bonding. Hopefully we can get a slot together for next week where we can maybe pick up with the cable sizing for earthing calculations. And just massive thanks for giving us the time again to come and chat. Hugely appreciated.
I have got, just before we end it, some examples of some common earthing arrangements that you would see within an installation. So if you wanted to run, maybe I could send them across to your mark at some point. And if you wanted to run a little competition, if I could send you 10, and if they can identify by the image what type of earthing arrangement is or whoever gets it, and then, you know, whoever gets the high score, we could sort them out, you know, some kind of little prize or something. But
absolutely.
Images I've took when I've gone to a real life installation, tried to identify the earthing arrangement. So I've gone to the meter box or where the incoming supply is coming in. And there might be a couple of them that are a bit of a trick one where you might think it's that, but actually it's this. But I used to use those quite a bit as a little bit of a get the brains ticking. But because those line drawings and things are very useful within the on-site guide and that, but how does that actually look from a real life situation? How does that, what do you expect to see? So I've got a folder of quite a few of them, but I can send you those. And if you want to put those in, a little bit of a competition or so, it might encourage people to want to learn a bit more about it. I'm sure Craig's got many images from a bigger scale, from a big 3-phase incoming main panel and stuff or whatever. We could put a few together. So
love it. We've got a few safe isolation kits that we can give out. So we'll do that on the next one. If you've listened to the end and you come back next time, we'll make sure there's a competition in there for you to enter to maybe win a nice safe isolation kit worth a couple of £100. Yeah, otherwise, if you've got any comments in and around this chat we've had tonight, please do drop them in below. As always, don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the show and subscribe to the channel. And otherwise, we'll see you on the next one.
See you guys.
Bye.